Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 7, Little Town on the Prairie. Chapter 10, Mary Goes to College. The last day came. Tomorrow, Mary was going away. Pa and Ma had brought home her new trunk. It was covered outside with bright tin, pressed into little bumps that made a pattern. Strips of shiny varnished wood were riveted around its middle and up its corners, and 3 strips ran lengthwise of its curved lid. Short pieces of iron were screwed into the corners to protect the wooden strips. When the lid was shut down, 2 iron tongues fitted into 2 small iron pockets with 2 pairs of iron rings came together so that the trunk could be locked with padlocks.
"It's a good solid trunk," Pa said, "and I got 50 feet of stout new rope to rope it with."
Mary's face shone while she felt it over carefully with her sensitive fingers, and Laura told her about the bright tin and shiny yellow wood. Ma said, "It is the very newest style of trunks, Mary, and it should last you a lifetime." Inside, the trunk was smooth polished wood. Ma lined it carefully with newspapers and packed tightly into it all Mary's belongings. Every corner she crammed with wadded newspapers so firmly that nothing could move during the rough journey on the train. She put in many layers of newspapers too, for she feared that Mary did not have enough clothes to fill the trunk. But when everything was in and crammed jammed down as tightly as possible, the paper-covered mound rose up high enough to fill the curved lid, and Ma sat on it to hold it down while Pa snapped the padlocks. Then, rolling the trunk end over end and over, Pa tugged and strained loops of the new rope around it, and Laura helped hold the rope tight while he drew the knots fast.
"There,"
he said finally.
"That's one job well done."
As long as they were busy, they could keep pushed deep down inside them the knowledge that Mary was going away. Now everything was done. It was not yet supper time, and the time was empty for thinking. Pa cleared his throat and went out of the house. Ma brought her darning basket, but she set it on the table and stood looking out the window. Grace begged, "Don't go away, Mary. Why? Don't go away. Tell me a story." This was the last time that Mary would hold Grace in her lap and tell the story of Grandpa and the panther in the big woods of Wisconsin. Grace would be a big girl before Mary came back. "No, Grace, you must not tease," Ma said when the story was finished. "What would you like for supper, Mary?" It would be Mary's last supper at home. "Anything you put on the table is good, Ma," Mary answered. "It is so hot," Ma said. "I believe I will have cottage cheese balls with onions in them, and the cold creamed peas. Suppose you bring some lettuce and tomatoes from the garden, Laura." Suddenly, Mary asked, "Could I come with you? I'd like a little walk." "You needn't hurry," Ma told them. "There is plenty of time before supper." They went walking past the stable and up the low hill beyond. The sun was sinking to rest like a king, Laura thought, drawing the gorgeous curtains of his great bed around him. But Mary was not pleased by such fancies. So Laura said, "The sun is sinking, Mary, into white downy clouds that spread to the edge of the world. All the tops of them are crimson, and streaming down from the top of the sky are great gorgeous curtains of rose and gold with pearly edges. They're a great canopy over the whole prairie. The little streaks of sky between them are clear, pure green." Mary stood still. "I'll miss our walks," she said, her voice trembling a little. "So will I," Laura swallowed and said, "but only think, you're going to college." "I couldn't have without you," Mary said. "You've always helped me to study, and you gave Ma your $9 for me." "It wasn't much," said Laura. "It wasn't anything like I wish I—" "It was too," Mary contradicted. "It was a lot." Laura's throat choked up. She winked her eyelids hard and took a deep breath, but her voice quivered. "I hope you like college, Mary." "Oh, I will," Mary breathed. "Think of being able to study and learn. Oh, everything, even to play the organ. I do owe it partly to you, Laura. Even if you aren't teaching school yet, you have helped me to go." "I am going to teach school as soon as I'm old enough," said Laura. "Then I can help more." "I wish you didn't have to," Mary said. Well, I do have to, Laura replied, but I can't till I'm 16. That's the law. A teacher has to be 16 years old. I won't be here then, said Mary. Then suddenly they felt as if she were going away forever. The years ahead of them were empty and frightening. Oh, Laura, I never have been away from home before. I don't know what I'll do, Mary confessed. She was trembling all over. It'll be all right, Laura told her stoutly. Ma and Pa are going with you, and I know you can pass the examinations. Don't be scared. I'm not scared. I won't be scared, Mary insisted. I'll be lonesome, but that can't be helped. No, Laura said. After a minute, she cleared her throat and told Mary, the sun has gone through the white clouds. It's a huge pulsing ball of liquid fire. The clouds above it are scarlet and crimson and gold and purple, and the great sweeps of cloud come over the whole sky are burning flames. It seems to me I can feel their light on my face, Mary said. I wonder if the sky and the sunsets are different in Iowa. Laura did not know. They came slowly down the low hill. This was the end of their last walk together, or at least their last walk for such a long time that it seemed forever. I'm sure I can pass the examinations because you helped me so much, Mary said. You went over every word of your lessons with me until I do know everything in the school books. But Laura, what will you do? Pa is spending so much for me, the trunk and a new coat, a new pair of shoes, the railroad fares and all. It worries me. How can he ever manage school books and clothes for you and Carrie? Never mind, Pa and Ma will manage, said Laura. You know they always do. Early next morning, even before Laura was dressed, Ma was scalding and plucking blackbirds that Pa had killed. She fried them after breakfast, and as soon as they were cool, she packed in a shoebox the lunch to take on the train. Pa and Ma and Mary had bathed the night before. Now Mary put on her best calico dress and her second best shoes. Ma dressed in her summer chalice, and Pa put on his Sunday suit. A neighbor boy had agreed to drive them to the depot. Pa and Ma would be gone a week, and when they came home without Mary, they could walk from town. The wagon came. The freckled boy with red hair sticking through a rent in his straw hat helped Pa load Mary's trunk into the wagon. The sun was shining hot, and the wind was blowing. Now, Carrie and Grace, be good girls and mind Laura, Ma said. Remember to keep the chicken's water pan filled, Laura, and look out for hawks, and scald and sun the milk pans every day. Yes, Ma, they all answered. Goodbye, Mary said. Goodbye, Laura, and Carrie, and Grace. Goodbye, Laura and Carrie managed to say. Grace only stared round-eyed. Pa helped Mary to climb up the wagon wheel to sit with Ma and the boy on the wagon seat. He took his seat on the trunk. All right, let's go, he said to the boy.
Goodbye, girls.
The wagon started. Grace's mouth opened wide, and she bawled, For shame, Grace, for shame! A big girl like you crying, Laura choked out. Her throat was swelling so that it hurt. Carrie looked as though she might cry in a moment. Shame on you, Laura said again, and Grace gulped down a last sob. Pa and Ma and Mary did not look back. They had to go. The wagon taking them away left silence behind it. Laura had never felt such a stillness. It was not the happy stillness of the prairie. She felt it in the very pit of her stomach. Come, she said, we'll go into the house. That silence had settled into the house. It was so still that Laura felt she must whisper. Grace smothered a whimpering. They stood there in their own house and felt nothing around them but silence and emptiness. Mary was gone. Grace began to cry again, and two large tears stood in Carrie's eyes. This would never do. Right now and for a whole week, everything was in Laura's charge, and Ma must be able to depend upon her. Listen to me, Carrie and Grace, she said briskly. We're going to clean this house from top to bottom, and we'll begin right now. So when Ma comes home, she'll find the fall house cleaning done. There had never been such a busy time in all Laura's life. The work was hard, too. She had not realized how heavy a quilt is, to lift soaked and dripping from a tub, and to wring out and to hang on a line. She had not known how hard it would be sometimes never to be cross with Grace, who was always trying to help and only making more work. It was amazing, too, how dirty they all got while cleaning a house that had seemed quite clean. The harder they worked, the dirtier everything became. The worst day of all was very hot. They had tugged and lugged the straw ticks outdoors and emptied them and washed them, and when they were dry, they had filled them with sweet fresh hay. They'd got the bed springs off the bedsteads and leaned them against the walls, and Laura had jammed her finger. Now they were pulling the bedsteads apart. Laura jerked at one corner and Carrie jerked at the other. The corners came apart, and suddenly the headboard came down on Laura's head so that she saw stars. "Oh, Laura, did it hurt you?" Carrie cried. "Well, not very much," Laura said. She pushed the headboard against the wall, and it slid down swiftly and hit her ankle. "Ouch!" She couldn't help yelling. Then she added, "Let it lie there if it wants to." "We have to scrub the floor," Carrie pointed out. "I know we have to," Laura said grimly. She sat on the floor, gripping her ankle. Her straggling hair stuck to her sweating neck. Her dress was damp and hot and dirty, and her fingernails were positively black. Carrie's face was smudged with dust and sweat, and there were bits of hay in her hair. "We ought to have a bath," Laura murmured. Suddenly she cried out, "Where's Grace?" They had not thought of Grace for some time. Grace had once been lost on the prairie. 2 children at Brookins, lost on the prairie, had died before they could be found. "Here I am," Grace answered sweetly, coming in. "It's raining." "No!" Laura exclaimed. Indeed, a shadow was over the house. A few large drops were falling. At that moment, thunder crashed. Laura screamed, "Carrie, the straw ticks, the bedding!" They ran. The straw ticks were not very heavy, but they were stuffed fat with hay. They were hard to hold on to. The edge kept slipping out of Laura's grasp or Carrie's. When they got one to the house, they had to hold it up edgewise to get it through the doorway. "We can hold it up or we can move it. We can't do both," Carrie panted. Already, the swift thunderstorm was rolling overhead and rain was falling fast. "Get out of the way," Laura shouted. Somehow, she pushed and carried the whole straw tick into the house. It was too late to bring in the other one, or the bedding from the line. Rain was pouring down. The bedding would dry on the line, but the other straw tick must be emptied again, washed again, and filled again. Straw ticks must be perfectly dry, or the hay in them would smell musty. "We can move everything out of the other bedroom into the front room and go on scrubbing," said Laura. So they did that. For some time there was no sound but thunder and beating rain and the swish of scrubbing cloths and the wringing out. Laura and Carrie had worked backward on hands and knees, almost across the bedroom floor, when Grace called happily, "I'm helping!" She was standing on a chair and blacking the stove. She was splashed from head to foot with blacking. On the floor all around the stove were dribbles and splotches of blacking. Grace had filled the blacking box full of water. As she looked up beaming for Laura's approval, she gave the smeared stovetop another swipe of the blacking cloth and pushed the box of soft blacking off it. Her blue eyes were filled with tears. Laura gave one wild look at the awful house that Ma had left so neat and pretty. She just managed to say, "Never mind, Grace, don't cry, I'll clean it up." Then she sank down on the stacked pieces of the bedsteads and let her forehead sink to her pulled up knees. "Oh, Carrie, I just don't seem to know how to manage the way Ma does," she almost wailed. That was the worst day. On Friday, the house was almost in order, and they worried lest Ma come home too soon. They worked far into the night that night, and on Saturday it was almost midnight before Laura and Carrie took their baths and collapsed to sleep. But for Sunday, the house was immaculate. The floor around the stove was scrubbed bone white. Only fainter traces of the blacking remained. The beds were made up with clean, bright quilts, and they smelled sweetly of fresh hay. The window panes glinted, every shelf in the cupboards was scrubbed, and every dish washed. "And we'll eat bread and drink milk from now on and keep the dishes clean," said Laura. There remained only the curtains to be washed and ironed and hung, and of course the usual washing to do on Monday. They were glad that Sunday is a day of rest. Early Monday morning, Laura washed the curtains. They were dry when she and Carrie hung the rest of the washing on the line. They sprinkled the curtains and ironed them and hung them at the windows. The house was perfect. "We'll keep Grace out of it till Pa and Ma come home," Laura said privately to Carrie. Neither of them felt like taking a walk, so they sat on the grass in the shade of the house and watched Grace run about and watched for smoke of the train. They saw it rolling up from the prairie and fading slowly along the skyline like a line of writing that they could not read. They heard the train whistle. After a pause, it whistled again, and the curling smoke began again to right low above the skyline. They had almost decided that Pa and Ma had not come yet when they saw them small and far away, walking out on the road from town. Then all the lonesomeness for Mary came back as sharply as if she'd just gone away. They met Pa and Ma at the edge of Big Slough, and for a little while they all talked at once. Pa and Ma were greatly pleased with the college. They said it was a fine place, a large brick building. Mary would be warm and comfortable in it when winter came. She would have good food, and she was with a crowd of pleasant girls. Ma liked her roommate very much. The teachers were kind. Mary had passed the examinations with flying colors. Ma had seen no clothes there nicer than hers. She was going to study political economy and literature and higher mathematics and sewing, knitting, beadwork, and music. The college had a parlor organ. Laura was so glad for Mary that she could almost forget the lonesome ache of missing her. Mary had always so loved to study. Now she could revel in studying so much that she had never before had a chance to learn. Oh, she must stay there. She must, Laura thought. And she renewed her vow to study hard, though she didn't like to, and get a teacher's certificate as soon as she was 16, so that she could earn the money to keep Mary in college. She had forgotten that week of house cleaning, but as they came to the house, Ma asked, "Carrie, what are you and Grace smiling about? You're keeping something up your sleeves." Then Grace jumped up and down and shouted, "I blackened the stove." "So you did," said Ma, going into the house. "It looks very nice, but Grace, I'm sure that Laura helped you black it. You must not say—" Then she saw the curtains. "Why, Laura," she said, "did you wash and the windows and, why, I declare." "We did the fall house cleaning for you, Ma," said Laura, and Carrie chimed in. "We washed the bedding and filled the straw ticks and scrubbed the floors and everything." Ma lifted her hands in surprise. Then she sat weakly down and let her hands fall. "My goodness." Next day, when she unpacked her valise, she surprised them. She came from the bedroom with 3 small flat packages and gave one to Laura, one to Carrie, and one to Grace. In Grace's package was a picture book. The colored pictures on shiny paper were pasted to cloth leaves of many pretty colors, and every leaf was pinked around its edges. And Laura's package was a beautiful small book, too. It was thin and wider than it was tall. On its red cover, embossed in gold, were the words, "Autograph Album." The pages, of different soft colors, were blank. Carrie had another exactly like it, except that the cover of hers was blue and gold. "I found that autograph albums are all the fashion nowadays," said Ma. "All the most fashionable girls in Vinton have them." "What are they exactly?" Laura asked. "You ask a friend to write a verse on one of the blank pages and sign her name to it," Ma explained. "If she has an autograph album, you do the same for her, and you keep the albums to remember each other by." "I won't mind going to school so much now," said Carrie. "I'll show my autograph album to all the strange girls, and if they are nice to me, I'll let them write in it." Ma was glad that the autograph albums pleased them both. She said, "Your Pa and I wanted our other girls to have something from Vinton, Iowa, where Mary is going to college."
Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 7. Little Town on the Prairie. Chapter 11. Miss Wilder Teaches School.
Early on the first day of school, Laura and Carrie set out. They wore their best sprigged calico dresses, for Ma said they would outgrow them before next summer anyway. They carried their school books under their arms, and Laura carried their tin dinner pail. The coolness of night still lingered in the early sunlight. Under the high blue sky, the green of the prairie was fading to soft brown and mauve. A little wind wandered over it, carrying the fragrance of ripening grasses and the pungent smell of wild sunflowers. All along the road, the yellow blossoms were nodding, and in its grassy middle, they stuck with soft thumps against the swinging dinner pail. Laura walked in one wheel track and Carrie in the other. "Oh, I do hope Miss Wilder will be a good teacher," said Carrie. "Do you think so?" "Pa must think so. He's on the school board," Laura pointed out. "Though maybe they hired her because she's the Wilder boys' sister. Oh, Carrie, remember those beautiful brown horses?" Just because he has those horses doesn't make his sister nice, Carrie argued. But maybe she is. Anyway, she knows how to teach. She has a certificate, said Laura. She sighed, thinking how hard she must study. She must study to get her own certificate. Main Street was growing longer. Now a new livery stable was on Pa's side of it, across from the bank. A new grain elevator stood tall beyond the far end of the street, across the railroad tracks. Why are all those lots vacant between the livery stable and Pa's? Carrie wondered. Laura did not know. Anyway, she liked the wild prairie grasses there. Pa's new haystack stood thick around his barn. He would not have to haul hay from the claim to burn this winter. She and Carrie turned west on 2nd Street. Beyond the schoolhouse, new little claim shanties were scattered now. A new flour mill was racketing by the railroad tracks, and across the vacant lots between 2nd Street and 3rd Street could be seen the skeleton of the new church building on 3rd Street. Men were working on it. A great many strangers were in the crowd of pupils gathered near the schoolhouse door. Carrie timidly shrank back, and Laura's knees weakened, but she must be brave for Carrie, so she went on boldly. The palms of her hands grew moist with sweat when so many eyes looked at her. There must have been 20 boys and girls. Taking firm grip on her courage, Laura walked up to them, and Carrie went with her. The boys stood back a little on one side, and the girls on the other. It seemed to Laura that she simply could not walk to the schoolhouse steps. Then suddenly she saw on the steps Mary Power and Minnie Johnson. She knew them. They had been in school last fall before the blizzards came. Mary Power said, "Hello, Laura Ingalls." Her dark eyes were glad to see Laura, and so were Minnie Johnson's freckled face. Laura felt all right then. She felt she would always be very fond of Mary Power. "We've picked out our seats. We're going to sit together," said Minnie. "Why don't you sit across the aisle from us?" They went into the schoolhouse together. Mary's books and Minnie's were on the back desk next to the wall on the girls' side. Laura laid hers on the desk across the aisle. Those two back seats were the very best seats. Carrie, of course, must sit near the teacher with the smaller girls. Miss Wilder was coming down the aisle with the school bell in her hand. Her hair was dark and her eyes were gray. She seemed a very pleasant person. Her dark gray dress was stylishly made, like Mary's best one, tight and straight in the front, with a pleated ruffle just touching the floor, and an overskirt draped and puffed above a little train. "You girls have chosen your seats, haven't you?" she said pleasantly. "Yes, ma'am," Minnie Johnson said bashfully. But Mary Power and said, "I am Mary Power, and this is Minnie Johnson and Laura Ingalls. We would like to keep these seats if we may, please. We're the biggest girls in school." "Yes, you may keep these seats," said Miss Wilder very pleasantly. She went to the door and rang the bell. Pupils came crowding in till nearly all the seats were filled. On the girls' side, only one seat was left vacant. On the boys' side, all the back seats were empty because the big boys would not come to school until the winter term. They were still working on the claims now. Laura saw that Carrie was sitting happily with Mammy Beardsley near the front where younger girls should sit. Then suddenly she saw a strange girl hesitating in the aisle. She seemed about as old as Laura and as shy. She was small and slim. Her soft brown eyes were large in a small round face. Her hair was black and softly wavy, and around her forehead the short hairs curled. She was flushing pink from nervousness. Timidly she glanced at Laura. Unless Laura would take her as a seatmate, she must sit alone in an empty seat. Quickly, Laura smiled and patted the seat beside her. The new girl's great brown eyes laughed joyously. She laid her books on the desk and sat down beside Laura. When Miss Wilder had called the school to order, she took the record book and went from desk to desk, writing down the pupils' names. Laura's seatmate answered that her name was Ida Wright, but she was called Ida Brown. She was the adopted daughter of Reverend Brown and Mrs. Brown. Reverend Brown was the new congregational minister who had just come to town. Laura knew that Pa and Ma did not like him very much, but she was sure she liked Ida. Miss Wilder had put the record book in her desk and was ready to begin school when the door opened again. Everyone looked to see who had come tardily to school on this first day. Laura could not believe her eyes. The girl who came in was Nellie Olson from Plum Creek in Minnesota. She had grown taller than Laura, and she was much slimmer. She was willowy, while Laura was still as round and dumpy as a little French horse. But Laura knew her at once, though it was 2 years since she had seen her. Nellie's nose was still held high and sniffing, and her small eyes were still set close to it, and her mouth was prim and prissy. Nellie was the girl who had made fun of Laura and Mary because they were only country girls, while her father was a storekeeper. She had spoken impudently to Ma. She had been mean to Jack, the good and faithful bulldog, who was dead now. She had come late to school, yet she stood looking as if school were not good enough for her. She wore a fawn-colored dress made of polonaise. Deep pleated ruffles were around the bottom of the skirt, around her neck, and falling from the edges of the wide sleeves. At her throat was a full jabot of lace. Her fair, straight hair was drawn smoothly back from her sharp face and twisted into a small French knot. She held her head high and looked scornfully down her nose. "I would like a back seat, if you please," she said to Miss Wilder, and she gave Laura a nudging look that said, "Get out and give me that seat." Laura sat more solidly and firmly where she was and looked back at Nellie through narrowed eyes. Everyone else looked at Miss Wilder to see what she would do. Miss Wilder cleared her throat nervously. Laura kept on looking at Nellie till Nellie looked away. She looked at Minnie Johnson and said, nodding toward Minnie's seat, "That place will do." "Will you change, Minnie?" Miss Wilder asked, but she had promised that Minnie might sit there. Slowly, Minnie answered, "Yes, ma'am." Slowly, she picked up her books and went forward to the vacant seat. Mary Power did not move, and Nellie stood waiting in the aisle. She would not go around the seat to the place that Minnie had left. "Now, Mary," Miss Wilder said, "if you will move over and make room for our new girl, we will all be seated." Mary stood up. "I'll go with Minnie," she said shortly. "I'd rather." Nellie sat down smiling. She had the best seat in the room and the whole desk for her own use. Laura was meanly glad to hear her tell Miss Wilder, for the record book, that her father was living on a claim north of town. So Nellie herself was a country girl now. Then suddenly Laura realized that Pa was moving to town for the winter. She and Carrie would be town girls. Miss Wilder rapped the desk with her ruler and said, "Attention, boys and girls." Then she made a little speech, smiling all the time. She said, "Now we're all ready to begin the school term, and we're all going to do our best to make it a success, aren't we? You know you're all here to learn as much as you possibly can, and I'm here to help you. You must not look upon me as a taskmistress, but as a friend. We're all going to be the very best of friends, I'm sure." The small boys were squirming, and Laura wanted to. She could not look at Miss Wilder smiling any more. She only wished that Miss Wilder would stop talking. But Miss Wilder went on in her smiling voice. "None of us will ever be unkind or selfish, will we? I'm sure that not one of you will ever be unruly, so there need be no thought of punishments here in our happy school. We shall all be friends together and love and help each other." Then at last she said, "You may take your books." There were no recitations that morning, for Miss Wilder was sorting the pupils into their classes. Laura and Ida, Mary Power and Minnie and Nellie Olson were the only big girls. They were the most advanced class, and the whole class until the big boys would come to school. At recess, they stayed in a group getting acquainted. Ida was as warm and friendly as she looked. "I'm only an adopted child," she said. "Mother Brown took me out of a home, but she must have liked me to do that, don't you think so?" "Of course she liked you. She couldn't have helped it," Laura said. She could imagine what a pretty baby Ida must have been, with her black curls and big laughing brown eyes. But Nellie wanted all attention for herself. "I really don't know whether we'll like it out here," Nellie said. "We're from the East. We're not used to such a rough country and rough people." "You come from western Minnesota, from the same place we did," said Laura. "Oh, that!" Nellie brushed away Minnesota with her hand. "We were there only a little while. We come from the East, from New York State." "We all come from the East," Mary Power told her shortly. "Come on, let's all go outdoors in the sunshine." "My goodness, no," said Nellie. "Why, this wind will tan your skin." They were all tanned but Nellie, and she went on airily. "I may have to live out in this rough country for a little while, but I shan't let it spoil my complexion. In the East, a lady always keeps her skin white and her hands smooth." Nellie's hands were white and slender. There was no time to go outdoors anyway. Recess was over. Miss Wilder went to the door and rang the bell. At home that night, Carrie chattered about the day at school until Pa said she was as talkative as a blue jay.
Let Laura get in a word edgewise. Why are you so quiet, Laura? Anything go wrong?
Then Laura told about Nellie Olson and all she had said and done. She finished, Miss Wilder shouldn't have let her take the seat away from Mary Power and Minnie. Nor should you ever criticize a teacher, Laura, Ma gently reminded her. Laura felt her cheeks grow hot. She knew what a great opportunity it was to go to school. Miss Wilder was there to help her learn, and she should be grateful. She should never impertinently criticize. She should only try to be perfect in her lessons and in deportment. Yet she could not help thinking, just the same, she shouldn't have. It's not fair.
So the Olsons came from New York State, did they?
Pa was amused.
That's not so much to brag about.
Laura remembered then that Pa had lived in New York State when he was a boy. He went on,
I don't know how it happened, but Olson lost everything he had in Minnesota. He hasn't a thing in the world now but his homestead claim, and they tell me his folks back east are helping him out, or he couldn't hang on to that till he makes a crop. Maybe Nellie feels she's got to brag a little to hold her own. I wouldn't let it worry me, Laura.
But she had such pretty clothes, Laura protested. And she can't do a bit of work. She keeps her face in her hands so white. You could wear your sunbonnet, you know, said Ma. As for her pretty dresses, likely they come out of a barrel. And maybe she's like the girl in the song who was so fine, with a double ruffle about her neck and nary a shoe to wear. Laura supposed she should be sorry for Nellie, but she wasn't. She wished that Nellie Olson had stayed in Plum Creek. Pa got up from the supper table and drew his chair near the open door. He said,
Bring me the fiddle, Laura. I want to try a song I heard a fellow singing the other day. He whistled the chorus. I believe the fiddle will beat his whistling.
Softly, Laura and Carrie washed the dishes, not to miss a note of the music. Pa sang low and lovingly with the sweet, clear voice of the fiddle. Then meet me, oh meet me, when you hear the first whippoorwill call. Whippoorwill, the fiddle called, and fluting, throbbing like the throat of the bird. Whippoorwill, the fiddle answered, near and pleading, whippoorwill, then far and soft, but coming near, whippoorwill, till all the gathering twilight was filled with the wooing of the birds. Laura's thoughts untangled from their ugly snarls and became smooth and peaceful. She thought, I will be good. It doesn't matter how hateful Nellie Olson is. I will be good.